Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce David Alekhuogie. The lens of a camera opens a portal that mediates the tensions between beliefs, reality, and aspirations. In this way, photography offers an image of an alternative self. David uses an array of media to explore the dialectical relationship between politics, identity, communication, power, and the constructions of cultural identity. As a Los Angeles native, David is deeply influenced by music and his love for hip-hop, which serves as a backdrop for much of his work. In his collection, Pull Up, David deconstructs the coded representation of urban bodies, revealing the politicization of style that at times has been a pretext for persecution. David returns to this theme in To Live and Die in LA, with images taken against the LA landscape, challenging traditional representation of Black masculinity. These images create a portrait of his hometown that embodies the contradictions within its history. While at Radcliffe, David is working on Care Package, a multimedia heirloom cookbook project that interweaves archival research with personal narrative. Foregrounded David's family's recipes passed down through generations, he explores the history of African American food and issues of cultural identity. David hopes this archival tribute can serve as a survival guide for those navigating how to form an identity amidst cultural alienation. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Theo Anthony, Mildred Londa Weissman Fellow here at Radcliffe and Film Study Center Fellow. And now please join me in welcoming David Alekhuogie.
I'm David. So, I am going to talk about my up-and-coming book, my first book, a Reprise. So, the goal is to show you some of the things that have influenced my book, that have influenced my work broadly, and just like how I got to be making the work that I'm making, and a little bit of the process. So I want to start with talking about this song, Amazing Grace. I'm going to show 4 different variations, well, actually 3 different variations, and talk about this idea of hyper-expressive function. So I initially became influenced by Amazing Grace when I stumbled across this live recording of Amazing Grace in a Los Angeles record store, Amoeba, in maybe 2020 during the pandemic when I was visiting my parents when everybody was locked down. And I started to investigate this phenomenon of Amazing Grace kind of being one of the most popular songs. I feel like it's as recognizably American as the national anthem, even though it's not actually an American song. So one of the examples that I stumbled across in my research was this version by Barack Obama that I'm going to show.
Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but Clementa Pinckney found that grace. Cynthia Hurd found that grace. Susie Jackson found that grace. Ethel Lance found that grace. DePayne Middleton Doctor found that grace. Tywanza Sanders found that grace. Daniel L. Simmons Sr. found that grace. Sharonda Coleman Singleton found that grace. Myra Thompson found that grace. Through the example of their lives, they've now passed it on to us. May we find ourselves worthy of that precious and extraordinary gift as long as our lives endure. May grace now lead them home. May God continue to shed His grace on the United States.
Okay, and this is Aretha Franklin's version. So, and the final one that I want to show is by Diana Ross. I feel like this one is the most traditional performance. And I think that it's because it's for a much broader audience, a much more diverse audience. It's coded in a way that is not as specifically for the Black community.
Take a moment to say hello to you. I'm not used to coming on the stage and performing for an audience without looking at your eyes and seeing your faces and saying hello. Hello, Budapest. Thank you so much. Thank you for your love. You're wonderful. Call me back sometime so I can be here with you. We'd like to do again Amazing Grace, a very special song and a very dear song for me. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. And look at your faces. lights up on the audience, please. Yes. Amazing grace, how sweet the.
So, briefly, I just want to talk about how that song has been super influential in my work. One of the things I started to think about was where the authenticity is, especially with a person like Barack Obama. We sort of understand him as a politician who's maybe speaking to maybe what we want and not necessarily what we need. So for me, I started thinking about where's the authenticity? What parts of it are genuine? What parts of it are performance? And is there a difference? And I started thinking of it as a play, as a piece of theater. I mean, it's obviously a piece of theater. And it's a script that is activated by the person who is performing it. I feel like it's activated differently by Barack. It's activated differently by Aretha Franklin. It's activated differently by Diana Ross. I feel like they're seeking to communicate at a sub-level to different audiences for different reasons. And the history of the song is really interesting because it's actually problematic in a lot of ways because it was written by a slave trader who ended up writing the song about his salvation from that and eventually became, a preacher and an abolitionist. But it became popularized during the civil rights movement and sort of used as this kind of, I think that people understand it now as a kind of Negro spiritual, and I started to think about how something that was essentially a script became a Negro spiritual through this kind of activation through performance. It was kind of transformed through performance. How can a script, a kind of piece of text or information, be transformed through its performance? And so I started doing a lot more research on performance and popular culture. I feel like one of the most important texts on this is the Irving Goffman, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. So the self is inconsistent. The ontology of self is social. We embody ready-made social masks. Who are you trying to convince with these masks? What are the economics of these realized selves? Does failure inform your social capital inversely? If you succeed, does that true self, if it exists, benefit from that success? Capitalistic modernity requires this fracturing, and those on the margins have liberated themselves through minding the gaps. So by minding the gaps, I mean operating on this kind of coded subtextual level in the same way that Barack is doing or that Aretha Franklin is doing. It's not so much about the words, but there's a sort of seance happening. There's a conjuring of everybody in the room's relationship to that piece of music. And so he's conjuring our all the sort of funerals that we've gone to where that song has been sung, maybe our parents' relationship to that song. He's conjuring all of these things. And so the music as a piece of kind of cultural material is being instrumentalized for, in his instance, kind of, political discourse. And in the context of Aretha Franklin, a variety of things. So I started to think about this idea of the mask and the sort of activation of the mask being a kind of articulation of the self that is unavoidable. I started to think about that through the lens of writers that I was more familiar with, like Frantz Fanon and W.B. Du Bois, is sort of pretty well-known theory of double consciousness, which is this idea of like looking at yourself through your own lens, but also looking at yourself through the lens of other people. So through the lens of Du Bois, it's easy to read capitalistic modernity as consequential to the Black experience. Performance then culturally, politically, and aesthetically becomes both expected labor and coded metalanguage. The rigidity of one's fixed self is too dangerous, and the space in between who you present and who you are is the liberation and the community. So I started also looking at, images of people going through publicly televised court cases. Like, what happens when the mask that you sort of present to the public is no longer successful? You see a bunch of Black men somewhat like fighting for their public perception through these kind of performances. You have like R. Kelly and this interview with Gayle King, where he's literally like breaking down in tears, not because of his own sort of indiscretions, but because his mask is slipping and people are starting to notice, right? And then this is the iconic photograph of O.J. Simpson. This is like Young Thug, and this is Jussie Smollett. So Fanon argues that Blacks are pressured and expected to conform by the colonizer's standards while simultaneously reinforcing an image of other. Fanon writes, "To make him talk pidgin is to fashion him to effigy of him, to snare him, to imprison him, the eternal victim of an essence, of an appearance for which he is not responsible." So this operating in the culture, in between the culture, is something that became really interesting to me, because there's this kind of expectation to conform while also maintaining the sort of hierarchical status quo. Like this idea that I remember, more specifically my experience growing up in a predominantly like white neighborhood, this idea that, the sort of question of your Blackness and whether you're Black enough is still pertinent, but at the same time, there is an expectation to conform to the sort of language of people around you. So there's this constant balance, there's this constant, fluidity of moving back and forth between like presenting a version of yourself that allows for people to see you as other, but also for you to conform to the status quo of what's going on. So, and this is a short film and a piece by Kendrick Lamar and Dave Free, The Heart Part 4. And he's using like AI to sort of embody all of these different characters that sort of exist, especially in the time that this was made, in the kind of public cultural consciousness, all of these Black men in the break, inside and in between the culture. In the song specifically, he's talking about the culture, as being a space that he is occupying, but also that like has the expectations of all of these other people. So, and this is like on view right now at LACMA, a part of a show that I'm also currently in. And I made this piece in response. This is a short film that I produced for Time magazine. It's titled Performing Stone. And it uses the melody from Kendrick Lamar's The Heart Part 4. And if you're not aware, Stone Mountain is a historic site in Atlanta. So let me just play this.
Confederate, American, I don't know that one. I don't know that one. Georgia. Confederate, American, I don't know these words. Georgia. No, that's the American flag.
Jump out. Uno.
So that was made at Stone Mountain. It sort of functions as a field recording. So I hiked Stone Mountain, which is a Confederate monument, and that has kind of been reclaimed by the public. People go there with their kids to go on day hikes. People go there to do yoga, to meditate, and the context and the sort of presence of that history is still like embedded in the site. And in the background, during this kind of field recording, you sort of like hear the children reacting to that. They're reacting to the fact that like they're seeing a Confederate flag in public, you know, on a national monument, and like sort of trying to grapple with what that means. And then I collaborated with a musician from Georgia Tech, Tuba Ken, who played the melody from A Heart Part 4 in Between the Culture. So, and then another piece that has been super influential is by William Pope L., who was one of my mentors in college. This is 2015 Trinket, the piece on this left side, and he speaks so beautifully about this.
I like this sort of, I like that objects in our culture, and maybe because we have so many of them, they start to take on qualities that maybe they don't possess. And the flag has a similar kind of, how would you say, animism about it, right? We bestow it this inner life. So I'm trying to take that seriously. This particular flag, this one out here, that one, I made it. We added one star, so that's my flag. It's not yours, it's mine. Only kidding. We share in the largesse, don't we? Yes, we do. And active enduring is something that talks about an ongoingness, but an ongoingness that has it's under stress. Like the flag is falling apart. Over time, the flag will simply open up like a flower. That in itself suggests a kind of aliveness. So I think the flag for me is sort of the it's a space. It's a space of disagreement and agreement. And that's what makes it a very interesting space. You have to honor it in a way that
So what's super interesting to me about that piece, the reason why it's so influential to me is because we think about the flag as this kind of sacred symbol. It's an object that he's sort of making perform, he's sort of animating and activating, and it's kind of becoming its own thing, it's becoming its own body, and how he talks about its belonging to us as a people, you know, that has been super influential in my work. So. And then one of the sort of primary texts that has been most influential to how I think about performance as a part of the sort of radical aesthetic avant-garde of Black music, poetry, theater, literature, this idea of operating in between the culture in the break. And the work started with a class that I did titled Archives in Practice, which was a critical reading of archive fever. And so, what happens when performing trauma becomes commodified? This idea of being in the group versus out of the group. So how has trauma been commodified and gentrified through performance? It happens readily through cults of personality and brand name activism. As social capital climbs the power hierarchy, the digital demands performativity, trading on our collective trauma as spectacle. If as a culture collectively, we are subject to racism, misogyny, class stratification, sexual violence, then to be victim to these conditions carries with it cultural capital to be mined. Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the names go on and on. They couldn't leverage their trauma, but those who perform the correct scripts during the correct times can leverage their trauma. So, I'm just gonna show you some of the, this is the cover of my book that's coming out in a couple months. And it's based off of my relationship to African sculpture through a lot of these Google searches that I was doing on African sculpture. So these are some of the, and when you do these Google searches, you'll come across images from Walker Evans, and also another critical reading on discourse on colonialism, and the wretched of the earth. So I was making all this work during the pandemic when I moved back in with my parents, and this is like one of my mother's books, The Wretched of the Earth, and it's backgrounded by this photograph during the pandemic of Target being looted. And one of the things that was interesting about this photograph is the fact that this really sparked a response from Target to really invest in this idea of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, like loudly and proudly in 2020. And that the sort of idea of that black square being in group versus out group is super interesting to me, because like now in the present day, in a sort of different political context, there's been like a large like pullback from DEI, and I find that like interesting that like it's about being in the group during the right times, performing the scripts that you're supposed to perform, during the correct time. So Susan Sontag, photography converts the world itself into a department store of museum without walls, in which every subject is deprecated into an article of consumption, promoted into an item for aesthetic appreciation. So that's one of the reasons why like I've been so interested in photography, because I begin to think by taking something that like exists in the public discourse, whether it's a piece of archival information, whether it's something from my own archive, then I'm able to reactivate that as like a new thing that I can mine for different aims. And this is Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord. And so this is like how I start to work, with like a lot of different like influences, on my laptop. It kind of functions as like a mood board, as like a knolled wall where there's all these different influences that I'm working on. And these are some of the images of African sculpture that have been I'm taking images from these representations and rebuilding them in the studio, sort of reactivating them as new sculptures, reanimating them. And this is one of the final ones. Ethnography versus acknowledgement. What are the levers and countermeasures allowing people on the margins to move from subject to subjugation? So I think that I've started to think about performance as this tool through which you can use to embed liberation into something that is essentially like, owned by the public or owned by Google or owned by Meta or whoever has gobbled up the rights or the information. Through performance, you can not only like liberate yourself but the material itself. And I think that that's kind of how I read Derrida's Archive Fever, in this way that we remember what we choose to activate and perform, and the things that we don't kind of are forgotten. So the scripts rely on their performance, and through that performance, you're able to sort of seize power over them. So the people who own the scripts, the people who generate the scripts, may seize power in one way, but through performance, you can take that back. And so this is the original image. This is some of the book images. This is the piece. Famous Picasso painting. And this is the piece that's on view at LACMA right now. And these are some of the newest pieces where, these kind of flat objects that are really more in dialogue with the book. They're sort of re-embedded back into the book. Now they're sort of becoming objects again, on the wall. So the idea is that these are dispersed out onto a table and then like scaled up and sort of put onto a wall. And then through their presentation, like each one of these is a unique addition, right? So through this kind of ordering, this kind of new ordering, this like reprisal, the piece is changed, right? Because like your access to the information is either displayed or limited through how I choose to arrange or display them. And these are from a series titled Scramble for Africa. The famous Man Ray photograph from Vogue. And this is from an exhibition at the Toledo Art Museum. And that's it. All right. Okay.
All right. Here we are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your amazing talk. We have the wireless microphones. We have the bottled water, so we know it's a serious function. David, your work is really an inspiration to me. I feel like we both come from this place of making images, and so much of the theory just comes from that deep practice of being out in the field with equipment, with people, and seeing what conflicts arise from the world. So I'm so interested in how everything that you've spoken about so far really arises from that. But first, I kind of just wanted to like unpack your work a little bit, because I think that you're both so generous and so humble at the same time, of just how radical and how much you are actually how radical you are in your treatment of this material, and just how much you're doing in the transformation. So I hope it's okay. I just want to just respond to that to sort of kick off the conversation. Oftentimes when we speak of photos, we speak of them as if they're fixed events. Something happens, I take a photo, that photo is evidence that I was there and an event took place. In the film darkroom, the fixer is the chemical that stabilizes the image on the paper and makes it permanent. And yet, when I look at your work, I see a strategic destabilization, an unfixing, an unmooring. A sculpture is stolen. Walker Evans takes a photo of that object. It's distributed. It is filed away and into an archive. You, as the artist, rediscover that, summon it out. You arrange it into a 3D sculpture again, take another photo, set it against fabric. Even the flattened texture of the fabric is ruffled up to give it a three-dimensionality. Finally, your hands float over top of the image, and then if that isn't enough, the frame is placed within another frame. I've heard so many verbs used about your work and how you talk about this, summoning, conjuring. I would just love to hear you talk about these transformations, and something I've heard you use a lot is your studio practice as a performance in itself. So what does that performance look like in the studio for you, and how do you move through all these material transformations?
So what you said about this idea of it being unfixed or destabilized is where a lot of my studio practice comes from. You know, because at the end of the day, I think that, you know, they're just one sort of like point. I'm sort of like, you know, changing the direction of like a history that already exists, or sort of like annotating it, you know, for sort of future review. So when the students like stumble across the book in the art library, now it sort of like augments the conversation around Walker Evans images, you know, right? So, but at the end of the day, they're still repackaged as images, right? So like they're evidence of, you know, their aliveness to me, but they sort of rely on the sort of future person stumbling across the new images to reactivate them and sort of keep them alive, you know? So like my idea is that they're alive. I'll show you that they're alive, you know, but the photograph is evidence that they're, you know, this kind of relationship between like photography and death, you know? So yeah, it's a you know, it's like Amazing Grace in a way, because it's a kind of melancholy relationship to the material. And so,
yeah, I think in the spirit, I should also first encourage people to please ask questions on the Slido link, the QR code. Have a bunch coming in already, but before I move on to the audience questions, something that you spoke about was your observation of the commodification of trauma, especially as a Black artist working in the time that we do. Moving from that observation to your own practice, I'm curious to hear you talk more about how you navigate that in your career and the work that you make.
It's something that, you know, has been a kind of struggle for me in terms of in the classroom, because like I'm always like teaching the material. I'm always trying to, you know, cover the ideas, but more broadly, trying to prepare my students for, to maybe sort of correct some of the mistakes that I've made, you know? Because no, you know, museum show, no fellowship is like worth your trauma, but at the same time, I think that there is a kind of, there is a power in relating to other people and maybe on a kind of sub-level, quietly acknowledging other people through your own kind of exposition. You know what I mean? Whether it's trauma or not, but as the sort of like digital kind of takes over as the kind of primary arena for culture, I think that there is a kind of capital to be gained, a sort of social capital to be gained, and I think that people leverage that, whether it's brands, whether it's celebrities, individuals, and I think especially cultural producers, because they're the most equipped to kind of climb the class hierarchy with those tools. And so to just like remain vigilant of that, yeah, it's a much longer talk,
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it leads really well into our first question from the audience. Are there some conditions required of performance, as you conceive of it, to ensure it is emancipatory and not recaptured for a dominant script? Or does that not matter, and it just becomes a moment from which another break can emerge?
Right. Wow, that's a good one. Are there conditions? No, of course not. I think that one of the things that's so powerful about Barack performing Amazing Grace is there's this kind of understanding, there's this kind of like sub-communication that's happening, this like on this level of, I'm sure, and it's interesting because he starts off talking, because I studied music, right? And the time, the way that these performers use time, right, is always interesting to me. And you can see the band or the people, because the audience is involved as well, right? There's this kind of like silent call and response that's happening, and
with the camera too.
With the camera
they're aware
too,
of the film,
right?
they're interacting with it, yeah.
And so I feel like it's very much happening in real time, And so it's somewhat improvised, but there's a sort of knowing that happens, There's a kind of, I feel like you're almost like rewarded for like being like long-winded, right? Or sort of augmenting your sort of relationship to the material and the time, I feel like Aretha does something similar, and I feel like recognizing the conditions is, it's a balance, right? Because like you can talk about, one of the things that I was thinking about the other day was how Ornette Coleman got kicked out of his band in high school for improvising too much, and Miles Davis like talking about how he's just out of control. This idea of being in the pocket. It's interesting to me, but like I feel like when you set these conditions, then it just becomes another script. It's just like Kendrick Lamar means this. Trust me, I am the authority on what this is.
Yeah.
Is I think like, oh, you must not understand what this is,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a non-answer, but
No, it always leads to the next question. So when you speak about performing the work, particularly archival material and or cultural artifacts, how does the temporality of that material manifest in the work, whether in your process or in the perception of the completed work? How does that temporality relate to the liberatory nature of the work itself?
the temporality. I think, it's going to change as things become memeified, like that's like one of the things, that's why I call it like hyper-expressive function, like as it becomes like, copied and memeified and different generations like stumble across what has happened, I think that the meaning changes, but like the index of the original moment is always, the most kind of pertinent issue, But I think about Amazing Grace. This is why it's like so interesting to me, because it's like transformed so many different ways over time. You have it functioning as like, this funerary song, this, song written by a slave trader, then it becomes like this civil rights protest anthem. And like through these different times, it means something completely different. You know what I mean? So, and each kind of, at each stage is sort of like in dialogue with the sort of previous one, all at once, simultaneously.
Yeah, it makes me think of the way in which you use citation in your work, not just the presentation. You didn't even talk about yourself for the first half, which I think is so generous as an artist to talk about where you come from, and the importance of citing your influences. And even within the work itself, there are citations that citations are generative in themselves and allow us as artists to maybe slip back into a teaching regimen, for the next artist after us. Something I'm like just sort of selfishly wondering, you were talking about masks and performance, and you're emerging out of this huge book project, the repurposing of masks. I think we are living in a moment that is definitively masks off. And we are seeing the falling away of old narratives of how the world works, and our maps no longer match the territory. Nothing we can make an image about as artists is wilder or more interesting than just opening up our feeds and seeing what's coming at us. How are you thinking about making images in this moment right now?
Man, I feel like I can say that I'm not sure, because it appears that like things are mask off, right? Like it's cool to be as edgy as possible, but even as I describe that is a kind of mask, is a kind of it's almost like a whistle or a call, it communicates a thing, and so I feel like for me, the most important thing has to just be like invested in my own joy. And that's like why I'm so influenced by that record, is because like it is a kind of conjuring of Black joy through trauma, which I think is like a part of the Black avant-garde specifically, and I'm always, and through a lot of my work, I'm like thinking about that. That's like what To Live and Die in LA is about, what a lot of the sort of work is about, this kind of melancholy relationship between like, what's happening to you and and how you're going to live or what you're going to do about it. So to be earnest, I guess, rather than to, look for the facts, you know? So.
Yeah, one of the first things I heard you say on this very stage was, I'm not interested in facts, I'm interested in honesty.
Right.
And I knew I was going to like you.
Right.
So I think in that spirit, I am not seeing any more questions that, oh, actually, there is a second page of questions that I didn't see. I would love to hear more about the hyper-expressive function in your work. There seems in both the performances of Amazing Grace and your work a kind of prolongation and repetition.
Right.
Is this a part of the hyper-expressive function for you?
Right. Well, I think about hyper-expressive function as this way of like being in between, like performing yourself or sort of performing the expectations that people put on you, you know? This idea that like Fanon talks about, where you're almost like forced into this kind of, you know, Pan-African pidgin language, because like that's the expectation of both your community, but also the people that seek to sort of other you, right? So like, I remember growing up, there was like, maybe, I'm trying to think, is it worse to sort of be accused of like talking to ghetto by like your peers at like in grad school or in middle school, or is it worse to you know, be back in your community and be confronted with a person calling you too uppity? Like, what's worse, you know? And I think that like that's where this kind of hyper-expressive function really starts to take shape, you know? Because when I think about Aretha, it is drama. It is theatrics, right? But like, there is something so comforting about that, you know? Like, yes, I get it, me too, you know? I'm going to do the most, you know, because I can, you know, because somebody like put me in charge to do that. Like, because I think about, you know, this history of performance being a type of labor, right? Like, you know, I think about that in the history of jazz and playing all these like, you know, all of these standards. I think about the idea, you know, I think about like Ornette Coleman, you know, improvising too much, you know, and just like crossing that boundary of hyper-expressive function, you know, or you know, how Kobe Bryant was one of my favorite basketball players growing up, and how he was like hated when he came into the league, you know, because he was doing all these 360 dunks and stuff. He was like, you don't need to do that, you know? But that was always so satisfying to me, you know, and then as he got older and more mature as a player, he sort of kind of, you know, slid back into that pocket, you know? So of when it was right, you know, it's just like, okay, now I'm gonna show out, you know? You
reveal the limits of the script to a new script.
Yeah.
And I think we see that in your work and continuing the tradition of everyone you've shared with us today. I would love to keep talking with you all day. This has been really amazing. Thank you to the audience for their wonderful questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other virtual Radcliffe programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.